Adherence to quality and standardization is more important than any other time in the history, be it manufacturing industry, automobile industry, or healthcare industry. Standard operating procedures, abbreviated as SOPs, are a tool in the hands of the managers and employees for enforcing best practices, to achieve process standardization, and to achieve efficiency and effectiveness in operations. A well-crafted SOP offers clear direction and instructions specifically designed to avoid deviations, which is an absolute necessity for maintaining compliance and delivering high-quality products. Inadequate standard operating procedures are one of the most important and frequently cited reasons for many deficiencies and observations. While SOP issues can be traced back to poor communication, poor monitoring and enforcement, a poorly written SOP can quietly grow into a host of other major compliance problems. So over the next 30 minutes or so, I, Dr. Shashikant Sharma, a management expert, a thinker, and a faculty at School of Management Sciences, will share with you the secrets of why SOPs are important, what are the important components of SOPs, what are the challenges in SOP making, and how to write a perfect SOP that mirrors your processes and will also help onboarding employees and to enforce best practices. I have deliberately kept this content generic so that the content herein is equally applicable to any industry, be it IT industry or be it any healthcare organization. Well, it is hard to remember the exact step-by-step of every process. Documentation makes it easier for your employees to get up to the speed on how to execute certain processes. All of us are different and all of us do things differently. But there is always a stance of a process which is a little bit more efficient than the others. You can establish this process as a best practices with standard operating procedures and making sure that all your employees follow this best variation of the process. Well, I remember many years ago, I was given an assignment in a management school to write a process paper. The professor explained that we needed to describe a process and skill that others may not know how to do it. A few years later, I was asked to write a standard operating procedure for disaster management of a tertiary care hospital. Though it sounded simple enough, I thought all I had to do was just write some clear explanations and a step-by-step procedure once again. Right? I was proved wrong in a minute or so. I quickly realized that writing an SOP involves more than just writing simple process. Do all conditions require standard operating procedures? Not necessarily. There are organizational reasons which might be different from different industries. Broadly speaking, an SOP takes into consideration the policies, the goals, the missions, the vision, and turns them into action. The SOP gives tangible, real-world guidance to help put appropriate policies in place. In addition, more specifically, there are a large number of organizational benefits that SOPs offer. SOPs help your organization to meet compliance standards, adherence to schedules, simplify and maximize production and output by making systems leaner. For examples, a hospital might have to have a compliance to a large number of mandatory and regulatory requirements and also certain voluntary accreditation requirements also. SOPs imbibe safety standards. They support training efforts. They ensure that the business activities have no adverse environmental consequences and prevent organizational failures, which can cost a lot. Well, imagine a large fire accident causing a huge loss of life and resources in a large tertiary care hospital just because the lack of a simple standard operating procedure for fire safety. A standard operating procedure is a document which provides explicit directions for completing a certain process and conforming to certain standards and producing desired outputs. As the tired old saying goes, there are tons of moving parts in a business or any organization of any size. Often the difference between a productive, a successful and not so successful business is whether these numerous parts are moving in concert with one another or not. SOPs ensure that. Every organization has a unique style of management, which is their own style of management, a peculiar one. But structuring your unique style in a way that it can be followed across all the verticals, across all the departments, and across all the team members for a long term is the key to sustainability. SOPs ensure that. For example, a manufacturing of healthcare products rely on precision, rigor, and consistency to produce reliable products for the patients, physicians, and consumers time and again, repeatedly again and again. Well, to drive this kind of a culture that consistently and effectively produces results of this nature, companies must create a culture wherein quality objectives are transparent, they are well understood, and they are acted upon routinely by each and every member of the organization. Standard operating procedures are essential for any organizational effectiveness and efficiency, and they are a regulatory requirement in high reliability organizations. SOPs ensure that the crucial tasks will still be completed in absence of key members when they are away on vacation or they are sick for any reason. That ensures business continuity and doesn't make any one of the employees indispensable. It also helps in knowledge management, where experienced members, when they change roles or leave for new opportunities, their knowledge can be retained in the organization within a team if they leave behind standard operating procedures. One of the major tasks of SOPs is to standardize a process and minimize the chances of errors. Errors in high reliability organizations like hospitals, aviation industries have a major impact. Error in these industries, if not prevented, results in loss of lives. Mistakes happen because we either don't have the information to perform a particular task, or we do have the information but we fail to apply that information consistently and correctly. And SOP is there to safeguard, to provide consistent quality and reduce the incidence of errors. SOPs help in faster employee onboarding and can be a great starting point for new members during their initial training period. It helps in employee induction, training, and retraining of employees on certain processes. Standard operating procedure is important because it allows organization to systematize their processes, keep all team members and other stakeholders on the same page, and move forward in a singular cohesive manner. Perhaps the best way to illustrate the importance of developing SOP is to consider the negative impact of not doing so. Basically, it leaves too much to chance. There is no guarantee that best practices will be followed at all times, that all team members will remain in alignment, and the organization will continue to operate in a positive and effective manner. SOPs ensure that. If one wants to define standard operating procedure, then it is a step-by-step instructions that help employee perform their tasks in a consistent manner. To put it simply, an SOP documents how a given process works. It's particularly important to have a written SOP for complex tasks that must conform to regulatory standards. To formally define, a standard operating procedure is a document consisting of step-by-step information on how to execute a task. There might be a situation in which you just have to modify or update an existing SOP, or there might be a scenario in which you have to write it one from the scratch. Well, it sounds daunting, but it's really just a checklist. A very big question is who should write SOPs? SOPs should be written in a step-by-step format which is easy to read by individuals, and they should be written by individuals who are aware of the activity and more so organizational structure. These individuals are basically subject matter experts who actually perform the work and use the process on ground. A team agreement can also be followed while developing SOPs, particularly important for multitask processes where experience of large number of individuals are critical. The most commonly used method for task analysis is hierarchical task analysis, abbreviated as HTA. Operating instructions should be close to the user and should be kept up to date. A well-written SOP should firstly define the purpose of the work or the process. you might consider involving any regulatory information or standards that are suitable to the SOP process and the scope to show what is covered. Any specialized or different terms either in a separate definition section or in a suitable discussion section should be explained. Quickly touching on to the basics, the purpose of these step-by-step instructions for performing operations is ensuring that personnel perform operations correctly and consistently in order to achieve a quality outcome through uniform performance. Keep sentences as brief as possible. Use simple, commoner terms. Never obscure the meaning of an instruction by using overtly technical or jargon terminology when a simpler, clearer word or phrase communicates the same idea. Be mindful of what you write, how well you write and what you write. Simple, action-oriented verbs such as identify, direct, evaluate, and review get the point across without requiring much interpretation. Passive sentences like the staff are required by the company to watch a fire safety video every year may be confusing. Instead, using an active form of a sentence, the company requires staff to watch a fire safety video every year. This provides much more clear understanding and it is much more direct and leaves no ambiguity. If at all possible, do not use passive voice while structuring sentences, as this has been shown to confuse and misdirect attention away from important ideas. SOP is a procedure which is a rule, and the user should have little discretion while using it. Always avoid using generalized terms that have no tangible meaning. Words like periodic, typical, general should be avoided. They do not enforce any consistent direction or execution of a directive. Ambiguous sentences like a periodic fire safety audit should be carried out by the organization and the findings may be documented. There is no point of using the word periodic and may. Rather, it should be more direct in saying fire safety audit will be carried out twice a year and findings will be documented. If your SOPs consist of long, dense paragraphs, the chances are that there is a better formatting scheme to follow. Bulleted items and lists particularly are effective for certain pieces of information as they focus attention and slow down the reader's pace. Now, odds are that your audience isn't choosing to read this SOP for fun. So you want to keep it short and clear. Otherwise, their attention will stray and they'll find the document formidable and hard to grasp. In general, keep your sentences as short as possible. Here is a bad example. Make sure that you clean out all of the dust from the air shaft before you start using them. Now, the same sentence can be converted into a better example by saying that vacuum all dust from air shafts before use. In general, don't use you. It should be employees. Speak in an active voice and start your sentences with command verbs. If necessary, interview the personnel which are involved in the process. It will give a better understanding on how they execute the tasks. The last thing you want to do is to write an SOP that is just plainly inaccurate. You're compromising the safety of your team, their efficiency, their time, and you're taking an established process and not paying mind to it. Something your teammates may find a little offensive. While preparing the SOP, if you need to ask questions, ask them. You want to get this thing right. Of course, if you don't know, ask multiple sources, covering all role and responsibilities. If one of the team members may not follow a standard operating procedure or another may not be involved in a portion of the deal, so it makes it more pertinent to ask a large number of multiple users whenever complex tasks are involved, and SOP is required to be prepared for that particular task. If you have a step or two that are particularly intimidating, make it easy on your readers with some sort of chart or diagram. It makes it easier to read and gives a mind a brief hiatus for trying to make sense of it all. And it will appear more complete and a well-written SOP for you. Don't include these just to bulk up your SOP. Only do it if it is necessary or you are trying to bridge a language gap. Your SOPs are probably one of the many SOPs within the organization. Because of this, hopefully your organization has some type of larger database cataloging, that is everything within a certain reference system. Your SOP is a part of this bigger reference system and therefore needs some type of code in order to be found. That is where notation comes in. Each page should have a short title or an ID or a revision number or a date or a page number on the top right hand corner, as in there for the most of the formats. You may or may not need a footnote, or maybe depending upon your organizational preferences, you might and you might not. While companies are free to develop their internal standard operating procedure documents in a format that works best for them, and most organizations choose from one of the formats which we are discussing right now. Step-by-step format. In some cases, it may be sufficient to create a simple numbered or a bulleted list of steps to take when completing the process. This format should be used only when the process in question is a straightforward one and in vast majority of circumstances can be completed without fail. Process in which a step-by-step format is likely sufficient include setting up of cleaning instructions, digital login sequences, and instruction for proper and safe use of any equipment. The hierarchical format of SOPs borrows from the above format. It involves listing of steps of the process to be completed. However, hierarchical SOPs provide additional details within each step as deemed appropriate. While a purely step-by-step SOP will list processes as step number 1, 2 and 3 and so forth, but a hierarchical one may include step 1A and 1B, 2A, 2B, 2C, or maybe 3A and 3B. The hierarchical format is used when more instructions are needed to be conveyed in order to complete a specific task or a process. As a simple example, if step 1 tells team members to log into their account, step 1A might direct individuals to put in their username and step B might direct them to put in their password. The third format is a flowchart format. Flowcharts are best used to illustrate standard operating procedures when multiple outcomes are possible at certain points throughout the process. In such cases, the outcome of one step will impact the way in which the team will need to approach each subsequent step. The figure shown on the slide is a typical example of a flowchart SOP. Based upon the type of usage, the SOPs can be classified into 3 types: equipment SOPs, analysis SOPs, and procedure SOPs. Equipment SOPs are how to calibrate, operate, and maintain an equipment. For every piece of equipment, an SOP must be written on how to calibrate, use, and maintain that piece of information. Analysis SOPs are to how to perform an examination, for example. For every examination, an SOP must be written explaining how to make the reagents, how to prepare the sample, and how to perform the examination within the lab, and how to perform quality controls for that particular lab test. By far, majority of the SOPs you will have to write fall in the category of procedure SOPs. Procedure SOP is written for any procedure, for example, in laboratory. This can range from collecting patient sample to cleaning of laboratory rooms to performing a management review. After getting to know what are the various types of SOPs, now an important question is how to decide which type of SOP to create for what type of process. While actualizing an SOP, one can choose from a number of different ways to organize and format them. Some of the factors which determine what type of SOP to create and use include: firstly, how many decisions will user need to make during the process? Secondly, how many steps and sub-steps are there in the procedure? Routine procedures that are short and necessitate few decision making can be written using simple steps format. Long procedures consisting of more than 10 steps with a few decision-making points should be written along with graphical format or a hierarchical format. Procedures that necessitate many decision-making may be written along a flowchart. Requirement for document identification and control, accountability, traceability, and responsibility must be involved with any SOPs, and this can be obtained by supporting a constant format. There are no official standard operating procedures to write a standard operating procedure. The steps which will follow will teach you how to write an SOP. But there are certain steps you can follow that will help your thoughts to be organized and plan the most effective path to standardizing your procedure. What's obvious is that you have a procedure within your organization that keeps on happening again and again, that is repeated over and over again. But there is a specific reason why this SOP is particularly useful. To ask questions like, does it need to stress safety or compliance measures? Is it used for training on day-to-day basis? Here are a few reasons why your SOP is necessary to the success of your team. To ensure compliance standards, to maximize production requirements, to ensure procedure has no adverse impact on the organization or environment. The point of getting to these questions is that if you know that what your SOP should emphasize, it will be easier to structure your writing around those points. It is also easier to see just how important your SOP is. Define what is the end result or goal is for your SOP you are writing. For example, if you are writing a document that describes the procedure for closing a restaurant each night, the goal is to secure the building until the preparatory crew arrives in the morning. This step will not include details such as how to clean floors, how to enable the alarm systems. You simply want to identify what the procedure will accomplish. All organizations have processes and procedures that are repeated daily, weekly, and monthly. As you define your goals, ask whether the SOP document is needed for that particular goal. Or see if the SOP has already been created to accomplish that goal, or maybe you just need to review it and look for ways to improve it. Never be in a hurry to create a new SOP. Ask yourself if there is a specific reason why this goal should be accompanied by a standard operating procedure. When you know what you want your SOP to accomplish, it is much easier to write an outline and define the details. Always remember that SOPs should be written from a purely practical perspective and from the point of view of those who will actually use them. Step 2. Choose a format. We have already discussed what are the various different types of formats which are available to write an SOP, but there is no right or wrong way to write an SOP. However, your company probably has a large number of SOP you can refer for formatting guidelines and outlines how they prefer it done. Chances are that your company has already some SOP documents that have been written. You simply can refer those documents as templates for preferred formatting guidelines. If you do not have any documents to use reference, try one of these ideas which we discussed, a simple step-by-step SOPs, a hierarchical SOP, or a flowchart SOP. Step number 3, consider your audience. There are 3 main factors to take into account before writing an SOP. Your audience prior knowledge, your audience's language abilities, and what is the size of your audience. Is the audience familiar with your organization and its procedures? Do they know the terminology? Your language needs to match the knowledge and investment of the reader. Is there a chance that people who don't speak your language will be reading your SOPs? If this is an issue, it's a good idea to include lots of annotated pictures and diagrams. Will large number of people across different roles in multiple organizations will be reading the document? What is the size of your audience? If so, you may want to write the procedures in a way that clearly defines who and what role performs each task. This helps your audience understand where they fit in each element into the process and why that particular part is important. If multiple people are reading your SOP at once, obviously in different roles, you should format the document more like a conversation in a play, like user 1 completes action followed by user 2 and so on and so forth. That way each reader can see how he or she is an integral cog in the well-oiled machines. Step 4. Determine the stakeholders and creators. As we have noted, any or all the personnel who will be engaging in or impacted by the SOPs should have some say in the creation of the document. Generally speaking, your SOP development team should consist of C-level executives who will be focusing on developing lean operations in an effort to achieve high level of business goals. They should include management leaders who develop best practices, necessary use of resources and equipment, and determine a plan for implementing the SOPs. They should also include the ground level workers to determine the validity and plausibility of the SOP in terms of logistics and resource consumption and the actual correctness of the standard operating procedure. You will also need to determine who specifically will be responsible for actually writing the document. Whether you rely on your current staff or a third-party entity on freelance basis, it is vital that your creator of your SOP specializes in technical writing and has in-depth knowledge and experience of your company processes and industry as a whole. Furthermore, your customers won't necessarily be involved in creating the document. You do want to keep their best interest in mind whenever necessary as well. While SOPs typically refer to internal, behind-the-scene processes, the processes which are likely to impact consumer experience in some way or the other. Meaning, you should never let your target audience slip back of your mind as you develop SOPs within your organization. Next step is to ask for input. Consider your knowledge on the process. What it boils down to is this. Are you the best person to write this SOP? Do you know the process it entails? And how could it go wrong? Do you know the answer to the question how to make it safe? If not, you might not be the best person and you should be considering handing off the assignment to someone else. A poorly written, or what's more important is an inaccurate SOP, will not only reduce productivity but also lead to organizational failures. It can put lives at stake. It can also be unsafe and have adverse impact on anything from your team to the environment and your organization. In short, this is the one risk which you should not take. If this project you have been assigned that you feel compelled or obligated to complete, don't just shy away from asking those who complete the procedure on a day-to-day basis for help. Conducting interviews is a normal part of SOP creation. Get the team together. Ask them how they think the job should be performed well. Are there any better ways of doing the job because they are actually working on ground day in and day out. They are the people you are going to ask to adhere to SOPs. So you want them to be a part of the process of creation of SOPs, and that all the necessary tasks are included should be made sure by interviewing them. There will be multiple drafts and reviews. Make sure you invite your team to review the drafts so that they can make necessary suggestions and amendments can be made well in time. Step number 6 will be to define the scope of the SOPs. It is possible that the SOP you are looking or working on is dependent on other SOPs or teams in the other departments in order to complete the task successfully. Determine whether it is sufficient to create a reference to those procedures, or you may need to add them to your current standard operating procedure document. Maybe you need a flow chart or a map to clearly define the dependencies and responsible parties from other organizations or other departments. Coming down to actually writing the standard operating procedure, we should be aware what does an SOP contains. The SOP generally contains two parts. First is identifying information, which is a document control information, and the second important part is the content of this standard operating procedure, which includes procedures and supporting information. Identifying information or document control information or metadata consists of control information such as logo, the title of the SOP, and so on. It is often rendered in the table on the front page or at the top of the document. However, if you have a simple 1 or 2 page SOP, you can also list this information along the left margin. Here are some of the examples of metadata. It might include organizational name and logo, the SOP title, the document number, the name and the signature of the approver, the version number, the SOP template references, the date of implementation or effective date and review date, and in the end, signed by whosoever has created, reviewed and revisited the standard operating procedure. As regards to the content of the SOP, it usually contains the sections as there are links to the referenced processes, any standards or regulatory requirement of this policy, the purpose of this specific SOP, scope of the SOP, what departments, groups, individuals this SOP applies to, the party responsible for the SOP, references to any documents which are used in the SOP, definitions of any jargons or any difficult words which have been used in the standard operating procedures. The next step is to train your end users. No matter how experienced or specialized your current team members are, they will be needed to be trained or retrained as the new SOP is to be implemented. This, of course, can be a very sensitive area, especially for long-time employees who are used to going about tasks in a certain manner and who may not see the benefits of making necessary changes. Your team needs to have full confidence that this isn't a gotcha type of ordeal. Rather, it is better to enable them to put their best foot forward and to be as productive as possible in their contractual duties. As we'll discuss further, you'll also want to point out to your team that this training isn't just a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. This will reinforce the idea that the new SOP is and will be the new way of doing things and will not be put to back burner after the novelty of the new process wears off. That said, the idea of training your team with regards to the new SOP deals only in part with the actual procedure in question, while focusing more on instilling in your team a growth mindset. Very important step is to test and tweak the SOP in practice. Piggybacking off the last point, you want to gradually immerse your team into the new SOPs rather than forcing them to dive into the new SOP. This may at first involve having your team work through the new SOP in a simulated environment. Here you might set up different scenarios in which a certain team members play different roles, allowing each individual to get a feel of the new process. Or you might simply discuss a hypothetical situation with your team and in open environment which allows your team to verbally walk through the process to be completed in said scenarios. Well, as your teams becomes more acclimatized to the new process, you might then begin unrolling the new SOP in real world scenarios. While there is no one way to go about doing this, you might identify certain team members who are more prepared than others and allow them to dive in first into the new process, then have them train other team members in the specific areas they need assistance with. The option lies with you. Again, though, this gradual unrolling needs to be intentional, and it requires that all team members actively work to make progress towards the new way of doing things. While you'll allow some leniency during the initial rollout, but too lax can cause your team to revert back to a much less efficient process from days of the past. The final stage of the process is, of course, to implement the SOP in full force. I will put the word final in quotation marks because, again, what's considered best practices in a given scenario is constantly in flux. To be sure, what works best today may be rather inefficient way to go about doing things mere months from now. That is why it is important to instill a growth mindset in your team. They need to understand that new processes are not set in stone and they will evolve as the need arises. Now, not only do they need to understand this, they also need to be a part of it. As your team continues to adhere to new SOPs, they should regularly take note of any positive or negative experience they are having along the way. Basically, this means noticing areas for improvement as well as areas in which more improvement is needed to be made. In addition to on-the-fly noticing, your team should also meet regularly, formally, to discuss further plans of moving forward. Typically, this will mean amending the SOP in a relatively minor ways, but it also could involve rebuilding the entire document from scratch if need be. It is also important to consider any external factors that may require your team to revisit the SOP. These factors include various regulatory changes, legislative changes, technological advances, and shifts in consumer needs also. In solidifying effective and efficient SOP for the time being, you allow your team to be productive as possible given your organizational current overall circumstances, while keeping the door open to make improvements to your processes as the circumstances change will be a good option. Very important, how to ensure success and accuracy. The only option is to test the procedure. If you don't want to test your procedure, you probably haven't written it well enough. Have someone with limited knowledge of the process use your SOP to guide them. Learn what issues they run across. If any issues are found, they are the best person to tell you, address them and make necessary improvements. It is best to have a handful of people test your SOP. Different individuals will have different issues, allowing for a wide variety of responses. Be sure to test the procedure on someone who has never done it before. Anyone with prior knowledge will be relying on their knowledge to get them through and not your work. Thus defeats the purpose of the standard operating procedure. Now, if we want to get our SOPs reviewed from the person who have not performed the procedure, on the other side, we have to review the SOP by those people who have actually done the procedure. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what your bosses think of the SOP. It is those who actually do the work that it matters to. So before you submit your work to higher ups, show your stuff to those who that will be doing the job. What do they think? Allowing them to get involved and feel like they are part of the process will make them more likely to accept the SOP you are working on. And they will be inevitably have some great ideas for you. In the end, do have your SOPs reviewed from your advisors and the quality assurance team. Once the team gives you a go-ahead, send it to your advisors. They'll probably have less input on the actual content itself, but they'll let you know if it meets the formatting requirements, the regulatory requirements, or any new other development which needs to be included in the SOP. And more so if you have missed anything in the SOP. The protocol for making it official and putting it into the system, what is the process to go about it. Route the SOP for approvals using document management systems to ensure audit trails of approvals. This will vary from organization to organization. Basically, you want everything to meet the guidelines and regulations, and it should be done in a proper, officious way. Signatures will be necessary, and in today's world, most organizations nowadays will have no problem accepting electronic signatures. Once approved, start implementing your SOP. This may involve executing a formal training to the affected personnel in the form of classroom teaching, computer-based training, or it may mean your paper is hung up in the bathroom. Whatever it is, get your work out there. You worked for it. It is time for recognition. Make sure that the SOP remains current. If it ever gets outdated, update it. Get the updates, reapprove it, and then document them and redistribute the SOP as necessary. Your team's safety, productivity, and success is all that matters. While there are many benefits of developing SOPs within your organization, doing so comes with its fair share of challenges as well. There is a reason your development of SOP should be a all hands on deck affair. Basically, If it involves only certain stakeholders, you will run the risk of your SOP missing the mark in some way or the other. For example, if your SOP is created solely by the C-level executives, it may focus more on the goal to be attained rather than the process required to attain it. This may cause the ground level team to run into a variety of obstacles that executives may not have anticipated, meaning the SOP in question actually isn't in line with what would be considered best practices for a given circumstance. On the other hand, if the SOP is solely created by the managerial staff, the SOPs may not take into account the C-level goals, such as minimizing resource consumption and improving the bottom line. In this scenario, you may have on-ground teams completing the task in a way that may seem efficient, but that isn't really doing all that much for the business as a whole. That said, the process of developing SOP needs to involve all the stakeholders, starting from C-level executives to managers to shop floor workers, and this will ensure that the process being developed are made in the best interest of the company and more so they are correct. Even after standard operating procedures have been developed, you will need to ensure that all stakeholders are able to access and engage with the said documentation wherever necessary. Without this accessibility and visibility, it can be pretty easy for an SOP to fall to the back burner, leading team members to go back to the old way of doing things. Obviously, this defeats the purpose of developing the SOP in the first place. Moreover, it is essential that the SOP documentation, your various team members have access to the exact same document across the board. The most effective way to ensure that is to keep the document in a centralized database that all stakeholders have access to. That way you can guarantee that all your team members are following the right document at all times. Regarding management and maintenance of SOPs, there are two main challenges to consider. Firstly, your team will need to be properly trained and prepared as to how actually implement the procedure in question. This means ensuring they have access to any equipment or any other resource needed to complete the task delineated within the SOP, and they know how to efficiently and effectively use these resources. If this piece of puzzle is missing, your team simply won't be able to act in accordance with the SOP, no matter how clear the document may be. It is also worth noting that what's considered the best course of action for time being may not always be so. Improvements in technology, personal changes, a variety of other factors may require your team to visit previously developed SOPs as the time goes on. If your SOP your team follows is outdated or obsolete in any way and they continue following it, it will end up doing more harm than good to your organization. SOPs serve as fundamental means of communication for all the levels of the organization. Not only do they involve employees, they involve departments, but they also allow management and employees to gain a cross-functional view of the organization. This approach encourages employees to think about the process change that may affect other functional areas. You may like to consider the butterfly effect. A good system forces employees to think through the processes and examine how the procedures might affect product, personnel, production, and equipment. Creating a standard operating procedure is perhaps the best way to ensure that your team puts in their talent to the maximum usage. In contrast, even the most talented of the professionals may not be able to be productive and effective in their position if they are not given proper guidance and explicit instructions. Moreover, even if your SOP aligns with absolute best practices, it won't do any good if your team isn't able to access it. That is why a centralized internal knowledge base is vital for implementation of the standard operating procedure. With a clear-cut, comprehensive standard operating procedure on hand at all times, your team members will always know what exactly should be done in any situation they face. In turn, your organizational productivity will all be certainly skyrocketed. Training is the most important step while developing an SOP or a SOP revision. Training also includes stressing the benefits of following the procedure and risk involved if the procedure is not followed. People are more apt to follow a procedure if they understand the implications of not following it. In the end, do remember that even the best of the written SOPs will fail if they are not followed. Procedures are not an end in themselves, and they do not guarantee good performance and results. Moreover, our well-defined systems and processes, qualified employees, and a motivating company culture do help. Procedures support processes, people, and the work environment. However, procedures cannot create a good process, a qualified employee, and a positive working environment.